Hi, welcome to this introduction to the evidence for evolution. I want to start off by talking about this group of animals we call birds. So birds are a unique group. There's many different types of birds, thousands of different species, and they have lots of different adaptations for different habitats or environments on Earth. There are birds that live in the mountains, birds that live in grasslands, birds that live in the jungle, birds that live in the desert. There's even birds that live in really harsh regions like Antarctica, the emperor penguins that we find in Antarctica. And you can see some examples here. Despite all these differences, birds of course also share some things in common. For example, all birds have feathers. And most birds can fly, not all of them, but most can. But feathers is unique in the animal kingdom. Now when we think about birds today, we might start to think about the history of birds and where they came from, because there weren't always birds on Earth. So we might wonder, well, if we have birds today and we didn't in the past, where did they come from and how could we figure this out? In order to answer that question, we have to go back to this theory of evolution, which is the main theory in biology that explains how species change through time and how species are related through time to other species by what we call common ancestors. So the examples we've looked at so far, the rock pocket mice and the Darwin's finches. In the case of the rock pocket mice, there were groups of mice living out in the desert, and after these lava flows about 10,000 years ago, populations or groups of mice that lived near these lava flows would have some individuals that might be born with dark fur. Those dark-furred individuals then had an advantage over the light-furred ones because the dark ones could go into the rock areas and find habitat and find food without fear of predators. And so over time, right, the populations that lived in those areas became dominated by dark-furred mice. We have a similar example with the Darwin's finches. In this case, we have a population or group of finches that lives on an island in the Galapagos. And after a drought in 1977, after even a single event, the population changes. Birds that are born with larger beaks have an advantage over birds that are born with smaller beaks. And after the drought, right, the population on average has larger beaks because more of the smaller beaked birds have died out. Now these are fairly intuitive and easy to understand, but the thing that we have to think about is that these are changes that happen in a relatively short period of time. And one of the big ideas in evolution is that small changes can build up over time to become really large changes. There's actually two terms for this. One is microevolution, which are these changes like in the rock pocket mice over the course of just a few thousand years, how they go from being mostly light to mostly dark, or the changes in the finches where the beak size gets just slightly longer over time or larger. And this is a change within a population or species over a relatively short period. But of course, if we let those changes build up over not just thousands of years, but over potentially millions and millions of years, those small changes can become quite significant. And we might have the formation of entirely new types of organisms, new species, even entirely new groups of organisms over very long periods of time as a result of these natural processes that we can observe happening on Earth today. So let's go back to our example of birds. If we think about birds today, one of their unique features is feathers. So something we might do is to look back in time by looking at fossils and look for examples of animals that weren't birds that lived in the past, but that had feathers. And for a long time, this was a scientific mystery. But eventually some fossils were found. This one on the left is really famous. This is a fossil that's called Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx is an animal that you can see has a long bony tail. Birds today don't have bony tails. It had teeth. It had claws, a whole variety of different features. But it also had feathers. And you can see on the right there, that's a recreation of what Archaeopteryx might have looked like. It looks kind of like a bird, but it also has some features that are very unbird-like. In fact, it has features that are more like a type of reptile that we call dinosaurs. And so we might think about that connection between today's birds and their ancestors, which would have had to be animals, some kind of animal that had feathers. And the only example that we can find of anything that lived in the past that wasn't a bird but that had feathers is a group of dinosaurs that in fact also had feathers. And when we think about examples of that, here's one. These would have been dinosaurs that generally walked on two legs and developed feathers over the course of evolution, not for flight at first, they wouldn't have been able to fly, but perhaps as insulation or for some other reason. And there's a lot of different types. We even know from different kinds of scientific research what color those feathers were in some cases. But you can see some interesting examples there. So, this suggests to us that the birds today are very closely related to these ancestors that were actually dinosaurs, and that had some features that were unique, but also some features that they shared in common with today's birds. Here's a couple of diagrams that show this. On the left, you can see we have this group up at the top there, the Triceratops, what's called an ornithischian dinosaur, or bird-hipped dinosaur. And then as we go through time, going up to about 110 million years ago, we see the development of the evolution of dinosaurs that become more and more bird-like. And eventually we have the Archaeopteryx there toward the bottom, which is a descendant of a group of dinosaurs called dromaeosaurids. And then starting about 140 to 130 million years ago, we have the ancestors of today's modern living birds. So, it seems kind of far-fetched, but what we know is that we have a whole variety of evidence, particularly in fossils, in genetic studies, lots of different ways we can look at this, that tell us that birds are actually very closely related to reptiles, and not just to reptiles, but to a specific group of reptiles, which were the dromaeosaurid dinosaurs. And in that sense, birds actually are dinosaurs. They are just the dinosaurs that survived the mass extinction that killed off all of the other species of dinosaurs in that group. So the theory of evolution predicts these relationships through time, and it predicts the kind of evidence we would find if this has actually happened. So if we hypothesize that birds and dinosaurs are related, we should be able to find some kind of evidence of that. And it turns out we can do this for any kind of organisms on Earth. We can think about their adaptations today, and we can think about, well, where did those adaptations come from? And what sort of evidence would we find of how they've changed through time? Now, big types of evidence are fossils. There's also biogeography. So in the middle there, you see that ring. Those are all the Darwin's finches. This whole group of finches, closely related finches, that all live in this one small group of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Right? That's because, as they talked about in the video, they evolved on those islands and adapted to different habitats within the islands. We can also look at anatomy. So we can look at, for example, the bones of animals and compare them or other kinds of physical features in order to try to understand their relationships. The other thing we can do is compare genetic information between species to find out how similar or different or how closely related one species is to the other. By genetic information, we could be talking about DNA sequences, we could talk about RNA sequences, we could even talk about the amino acid sequences or protein sequences that are encoded by the DNA. So, here's an example, some different species. They have some little numbers there on the left, and they're showing this particular sequence of some portion of their RNA. In this case, you can see the U there instead of the T, and they're comparing them, and they're looking for places where they're similar or the same, and places where they differ. The idea being that if you have the sequence from one species and it's very similar to another, those two are relatively closely related compared to two species where there are lots of differences. And we can use this information to construct a diagram or phylogenetic tree that shows those relationships. Here's one that's been in the news lately that's kind of important in current events. This is a phylogenetic tree of coronaviruses that cause severe acute respiratory syndrome. So you can see the branches all connect back to the base there on the left side. That would be the ancestor of all of the viruses that we have today. The branch kind of leading up toward the top is the SARS outbreak from 2009. And then the branch on the bottom you can see leads to those red dots where we see SARS-CoV-2. And so what they're doing here is comparing the genetic sequences within today's coronaviruses and trying to find out what other viruses they're related to so that they can understand how those viruses evolved and where they came from. If you look at the diagram carefully, you see the Wuhan viruses with the red, Wuhan location viruses with the red dots are closely connected to coronavirus found in a bat, which then, if we look back, that branch connects into some viruses that are found in pangolins, which is another animal there that we find in Asia. So scientists think that, the coronavirus that is causing the current epidemic probably originated in bats and pangolins and eventually changed through mutations to where it could infect human cells. But they'll create trees like this to understand that history and try to understand how these viruses are changing and working. So phylogenetic trees connect species to common ancestors based on their degree of similarity. We call this oftentimes the tree of life, and it's a way of looking at different groups. Here's a phylogenetic tree for primates, so you can see some apes and gorillas and humans and other tarsiers and all kinds of stuff on there, and it's connecting them together based on some studies of their genes. We could do this for all life on Earth. So if we start to think about not just animals like mammals, but other types of animals, amphibians, fish, and then even things that are less familiar to us like sea stars and jellyfish and so forth, and even connecting those to other types of organisms like fungi and plants and archaea and even to bacteria. So when you look at the diagram here, you can see the whole thing connects all together at the root there in the middle where it says Earth birth, something like 3.5 billion years ago. So, the idea in evolution is that we have the original forms of life on Earth, the very first forms of life, and that over the course of billions and billions of years, those early primitive life forms change and evolve and eventually become all of the different species and organisms that we have today. We can look at any kind of living thing and really ask the same question that we do about the birds. We can even think about ourselves. There's a lot of human diversity. There's a lot of different features that we find in different parts of the world in human populations. But of course, we're all human and all very similar in some ways as well. And we know that humans haven't always been on Earth. So we might think about, well, where did humans come from? And this is something we'll look at later in the unit as well. But we know that there have been other species with very similar traits to us, just in the same way that we have dinosaurs that have feathers. We have species that lived in the past that had a lot of characteristics very similar to modern humans, but yet also had some characteristics that were very different. A lot of times we see this diagram where it's kind of an ape on one side and then gradually kind of in a line going upright all the way to modern humans. That's not really the way that we would think about this in evolution. We would think about it more as a human family tree with lots of different branches and lots of different kind of meandering paths. So here's an example of a human family tree and lots of different species. And we're essentially just one little branch on this tree. In fact, we're one of the only branches that still survives. A lot of these species have gone extinct, died out, but we're still here. But as we go back in time, we can think about, well, where did we come from? How did we evolve? So we'll be working on learning a little more about phylogenetic trees and the evidence for evolution. And hopefully you'll find that interesting as we start to look into not only origins of other species on Earth, but our own origins as well. And thinking about how do we study that? How do we know where we came from, where all of these amazing living things on Earth today came from?